Thank you, Abigail, for such a kind introduction. And thank you all for coming tonight. There are members of my school, there are friends and family. A particular shout out to the Cambridge crew, who I got to know when I was on fellowship there in 2019, and to the Cambridge crew online too, but also those who made the trek, to Caroline, who told me what an inaugural lecture was, and if she hadn't, I'm not quite sure what you would have gotten tonight, but also to the lovely people at LIAS who have been so patient with me with all of my questions and concerns about tonight. And for those of you online, as Abigail said, we do have quite a breadth. Our son in Jordan, all the way to my in-laws on the west coast of America. So they're in I don't know how many time zones. Hopefully they're still awake or waking up. I'll try not to put them back to sleep. And a particular shout out to the Go-To Gals and the Seasons. They know who they are. Particular friends Skyping in from across the world, or Zooming in, or panopticating in, whatever we're using here. Okay, so likely due to my exotic accent, wherever I go in Lincoln, be it to the shops, the restaurant, or the optometrist, I am often confronted with the question, why are you in Lincoln? Or what brings you to Lincoln? To borrow a lyric from one of my favorite musical artists, David Byrne, formerly of the Talking Heads, my favorite punk band, well, how did I get here? And those are the lyrics. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the state that looks like a hand. Right? My father was a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, and my mother was a politician. Growing up in an academic household was formative. Dad used to hold seminars in our lounge and bring home all sorts of fossils. So virtually from toddlerhood, I was exposed to the life of an academic. From a young age, I was always interested in history. An interest that was nurtured by visits to my maternal grandmother's home in Holly, New York. She was the last of several lines in this small New England village. And her house, which was built by my great-grandfather in 1876, great-great-grandfather in 1876, her house was chock full of family heirlooms. And they all came with a name and a story. From Aunt Dell's rocker to Grandma Ludington's chandelier to Sarah Glidden's handmade coverlet. Connection to the past was tangible. I learned about American history from the stories about my family, particularly the women. This interest was reinforced by my consumption of a series of young adult biographies on historical women, as well as Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House books. So I guess I was destined to be a historian. But why medieval history? When I was 9, my father had a post at the World Health Organization in Geneva. We took many trips, and I distinctly remember my mother commenting on a fresco, which she said was from the Renaissance. And I should mention that my mother studied art history at Vassar College with Adolf Katzenellenbogen. And most of you won't know who that is, and that's okay. But for the medieval scholars in the room, the name will be familiar. So I asked my mother, well, what was the Renaissance? And she said, well, it was the time after the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages. Ooh. What were those? They sounded far more interesting than the Renaissance. And so I was hooked. My passion for the Middle Ages was fed by my time as an undergraduate at Michigan State University. And please note, this is not the University of Michigan. This was my rebellion against my rather famous father. While at Michigan State, I studied with Richard Sullivan, a Carolingianist who specialized in the early Middle Ages, and Emily Tabuteau, a medievalist who works on 11th century Normandy. It was at MSU that I also met Joseph and Issa Konvitz. Joseph taught me modern French history, and they had been my boon companions on many trips around France over the years, and whose family hospitality I enjoy whenever I'm in Paris. I also met my partner, Gordon Thompson, whose question, who do you like better, Rembrandt or Vermeer, I still don't have an answer for sometime later. We won't say quite how much longer that was. I knew I wanted to pursue a master's in early medieval history. I wanted to dig into those dark ages. I ended up staying for a PhD and was all set to do a thesis on the Carolingians when I first read Georges Duby, a noted medieval French historian. Again, I was hooked. I started researching aristocratic family life with an eye to testing Duby's theory about a wholesale change in aristocratic family structure in the 11th century, one that resulted in the marginalization of women and the precedence given only to the male family members. And slight spoiler alert, Duby was wrong. As Abigail mentioned, one of my first book, right? Well, the rest, as they say, is history. I have spent my career investigating aristocratic family life. My first book took a prosopographical approach, meaning that I assembled a portrait of medieval family life from the lives of many different aristocrats. The book offered a new vision of family life, one based on affection, support, and collaboration, and one in which women were vital, indeed recognized family members. David Crouch, a medieval historian and a colleague, once told me that his students liked my book because it was, I quote, warm and squishy. And those of you who know David will appreciate that comment. Right. But I took that as a compliment. Following that monograph, my next project developed for my teaching of undergraduates at Wittenberg University in Ohio. This book tells the story of the Central Middle Ages through the lives of members of one aristocratic family, the Beaugencies. This was a delightful book to write, and for which I also developed a digital humanities project. And I will say one of the highlights of writing this book was I got to spend a day in Beaugency being shown around by one of the local historians and then feted at the town hall by the mayor with a 4-course lunch and appropriate wine accompaniment. It was lovely. It was in researching this book that I first encountered my current research project, Countess Ermengarde of Brittany, who lived from about 1070 to 1147. My academic career has been dedicated to weaving women into the history of Western Europe. My lecture tonight will introduce you to Ermengarde and discuss how one goes about assembling the life of a medieval countess and restoring her to her rightful place in the narrative of the medieval past. So we'll start with finding Ermengarde. And here we have a chart, sort of like looking for finding Waldo. Is that something over here? But as you can see, you should be able to find Ermengarde. She's right here. But as you can see from this impressive diagram and genealogy, she was related to some rather important people. She was the daughter of one count, wife of another count, mother to a third, and half-sister to a king, and great-aunt to another king. And don't worry, I won't quiz you on this later, I promise. Next, I'd like to show you an overview of her life. And just to see, right, here's Ermengarde, but you can see her descendants are also rather royal, right? Her great-granddaughter marries the son of King Henry II. Conan marries Margaret of Scotland. So she's a fairly well-placed individual. Okay. As I hope you can see from just this brief sketch, what a fascinating and complex life she led. And this is just the tip of a rather large iceberg. Ermengarde really is an ideal topic for a biography, or perhaps more appropriately, a written life. Yet I'm fairly certain that outside a couple people in the audience who are experts on medieval women, as well as those friends, families, and colleagues who I've Ermengarded, no one has ever heard of this interesting woman. Why is that? Well, perhaps she was not well known or well regarded in her own time. Well, no. As these quotes clearly indicate, not only was she known, she was well respected by important people of her day. And I'm going to ask you to remember the top line of this, daughter of folk, glory of Brittany, because that's how we're going to frame her life going forward. All right. But this perception changes rather dramatically when we get to the modern era, as the next two quotes indicate. All right? Yeah. Don't tell me about the Dark Ages. Yeah. These two sets of quotations are clearly at odds with one another and do not seem to describe the same woman. Clearly, the reputation of Countess Ermengarde of Brittany has declined markedly since her own time. One might ask, given the respect she commanded, particularly of members of the clergy who have been often characterized as notoriously misogynistic, why has she not been recognized by modern scholars as influential and an important part of the history of medieval France? It is a vexing question, and the answer, I fear, lays more with the attitudes and worldview of scholars rather than Ermengarde's own accomplishments. Regrettably, this tendency of dismissing women and reducing them to passive objects continues, as the quote from the distinguished French historian Jacques Delacan indicates there. But even more recently, in 2014, when faced with the choice of including a document that recorded Countess Ermengarde's active role as co-ruler of Brittany, the editors of a collection of the official acts of the Counts of Brittany chose a later copy of the document that erased Ermengarde's participation. It was a deliberate choice that records the history of medieval Brittany in a deliberate way, one that excludes, indeed erases, women. So, looking for Ermengarde. As many members of the audience know, one can develop wonderful research questions and topics, but are they actually feasible? Are there sufficient sources or the right type of source to investigate a question or subject? My fear was that I was going to find the documents that I would need to do justice to Ermengarde's life simply weren't extant. But given that I'm giving this talk and have published several articles on Ermengarde and I'm working on a biography, clearly there are sufficient sources to put flesh on the bare bones of the chronological skeleton that I have developed. I had to cast the net widely to assemble the pieces of Ermengarde's life, and my investigations have taken me to some rather lovely places. It has been, and will continue to be, I hope, an adventure. So what documents and other sources can I put to use to paint a portrait of our Countess? One of the challenges of doing medieval women's history is the fact that we have to rely largely on what other people said about them. There are very few medieval lay women who wrote sources. Abbesses, poets, philosophers, and mystics are something of an exception. For a woman of Ermengarde's time, and remember she lived from 1070 to 1147, and her status, their personalized voices are scant. In Ermengarde's case, I have only one document, so far, that is recorded in her voice, and it's a copy. So I'm relying on documents that weren't penned with the intent of providing information on Ermengarde's life directly. They have to be mined differently for information, but also put in concert with other sources to reveal a pattern, a fact, or an experience. Right. The backbone of my study is a particular genre of sources called documents of practice. These sources record how things were done, as opposed to prescriptive sources, like laws, which indicate how things should be done, or imaginary sources, like literature, that portray the world the way the author wishes it to be. The documents of practice that are most plentiful are medieval charters, and here you have an example of a charter, one from the archives at Angers, to give you the idea of the sorts of details these documents can contain. And I know I have several fellow charteraholics in here with me. I won't name names, but we all enjoy a good charter. And essentially what a charter was is that it records the transferal of property, usually from a member of the laity to the church. And here what we have is Countess Ermengarde, right, and her husband Alan, and their two young sons, Conan and Geoffrey. And they're making a donation to the Abbey of Fontevraud. Unlike modern property transfers, these documents can be delightfully chatty, indeed loquacious, and provide all sorts of nuggets of information. In addition to charters, I'm also using letters, chronicles, and literature to provide context and color. But where, you might ask, do you find these sources? I think my next slide is a giveaway, huh? The documents that I need to consult are housed in archives. In France, at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and here you have a beautiful slide of the manuscript reading room, but also in the Archives Départementales, that are repositories of local history. My first stop in finding Ermengarde was at the archive in Rennes, which Rennes was one of the two important communal residences during Ermengarde's time. However, because she was also born in Anjou, the neighboring county, I've also consulted documents there. Charters are usually recorded as single-sheet documents. Here you have two examples, and they can vary in size from the small, which is the one up in the right-hand corner, is actually pretty small. It's about like that. And then one below it, which is slightly larger. And there are obviously challenges to reading these sources because, they have little chew holes in them from our little friends, the mice. And also, things just get broken and chipped away. The ribbons down here would have been where a seal would have been attached. But charters can vary in size from the very small to the rather large. And here we have another example. And when you try to read and transcribe these things, it can be like a kind of game of Twister, where you have to put an elbow one place and an elbow another place and a foot there, right, to try to pull these documents apart. Because they're written on parchment, animal skin, and when they're folded up for decades, they're very difficult to disentangle. So it can be kind of fun trying to pull them apart and transcribe and translate at the same time. But that's part of the fun, isn't it? But religious houses also copied these single-sheet charters into codices that are called cartularies. And I will apologize to my fellow medieval charteraholics. I know it's cartulary, but over here, but I'm an American, and I don't think I can reprogram my brain to say cartulary. So I'm afraid you're going to have to suffer through cartulary for the endurance of this speech. Usually the construction of a cartulary was in response to a particular event or concern on the part of the religious house. But due to the accidents of history, I've also spent time at the British Library, as the only 12th century cartulary, or collection of charters from Brittany, the Cartulary of Sainte Croix of Camperlé, is housed there. And you may ask, well, how did it get there? It is an interesting story, and thanks to the intervention of another aristocratic woman, Lady Violet Beaumont. Remarkably, the Cartulary of Sainte Croix remained in its monastery until the French Revolution, right around about 1790 to 1791. One of the monks smuggled it out with his personal effects. However, when the monk fell ill, he gave it to a local doctor in return for treatment. The doctor's son, in turn, sold it to a Paris bookseller, where Mr. Stapleton purchased it and brought it back to his home, Carlton Towers, in Yorkshire. At his death, his nephew, Lord Beaumont, inherited his estate. At about the same time, it's about 1850, the director of the Bibliothèque Nationale was searching for French manuscripts that had left the country. He commissioned a Monsieur Léon Maitre to try to see the cartulary in England. After much negotiation and seeking the assistance of everyone from the local curate to diplomats to high-flying aristocrats, Monsieur Maitre was granted permission to look for the cartulary in Carlton Towers, literally to open drawers and rummage through cupboards. And I sort of imagine something like, a house, aristocratic country house, replete with, first editions stacked higgledy-piggledy all over, maybe a nice, 11th century manuscript stuck under a chair leg to make it, even. It must have been really something. And Monsieur Maitre spent 8 days searching for the document and was devastated since he was unable to locate the manuscript. Seeing his distress, Lady Beaumont was moved to assist in the search, but soon tired. When she went into the salon to rest, she moved about some materials, books, and magazines, and voila, the Cartulary of Sainte Croix of Camperlé was discovered. Thank heavens. Permission was given to make a transcription of the document, and realizing the importance of the cartulary, Lady Violet donated it as part of the Egerton collection to the British Library, where it remains today. And if you want to see it, you can actually see it online. It's been digitized. And just as an aside, Lady Violet was a rather interesting woman in and of her own right. She was vice president of the Red Cross during World War I, and it looks like she was a bit of a rebel. So, I don't know, kindred spirit, maybe? Yeah. In addition to written documents, objects, space, and landscape also yield important information about the life of Countess Ermengarde. As I will discuss in a few minutes, this object of an episcopal staff was crucial to uncovering Ermengarde's role in a critical moment in the history of the county of Anjou. Spaces and the construction of spaces also have been very profitable in understanding Ermengarde's life. During the course of her life, she personally founded 2 ecclesiastical communities, Saint-Sulpice-la-Forêt, located just a few kilometers north of Rennes in Brittany, and the Church of the Savior in the Crusader states in the Levant. Each of these monuments was constructed in a particular style to convey a specific affiliation to a religious order. Hence, they are useful in tracing Ermengarde's allegiances, but also testament to the considerable financial wealth she controlled. Finally, understanding the geography and landscape also provided answers to some questions about the Countess's life. And here we have a map, and I just want to say, my husband is my cartographer extraordinaire, who has made dozens of maps for me, but also many of my friends and for other academic presses. And this is, you can see what lovely work he does. So if anybody in here needs a map, I know a guy. So Ermengarde, just a little geography lesson, right? So here we have France, and here we have the area of France that this portion represents. Ermengarde spends most of her life pretty much in this area, sort of in Greater Anjou. This is the county of Anjou over here. But also then when she marries Count Alan, she moves to Brittany. She's born here in Angers, and as a young woman traveled up and down the Loire River, up to the Abbey of Marmoutier here, just outside of Tours. She will also spend time at Fontevraud, as I'll mention in a little bit. But then when she moves from Angers, she moves west and into the heartland of Brittany, where she spends most of her time here in Nantes, but also up here in Rennes. And here's Saint-Sulpice-la-Forêt right there. I want you to remember the Loire Valley here, because this is very important to Ermengarde's life as well. It's sort of the geographical locus of her power. In charting her life, I found that Ermengarde traveled to Western Brittany only once in the 40 years that she was countess. This seems strange, given the Communal family's connection to the western portions of the county. However, when one looks at a linguistic map, some clarity is provided. Ermengarde was francophone and did not speak Breton, a Celtic language that is the language spoken in the western portions of Brittany. This, I believe, circumscribed her area of activity and influence to the eastern part of the county. Specifically, oops, I knew I'm going to do it again. I tell you, me and technology, man. All right, so she spends most of her time here in the Pays de Rennes and the Pays Nantais. So that's pretty much where, while she's countess, she spends her time. So her area of influence is subscribed to the eastern part of the county. Given that Count Alan IV married Ermengarde for her connections to Anjou and the Loire Valley, her focus on these areas makes sense. Now that I have described the pieces that can be put together to create a narrative of Ermengarde's life, let's now turn to her actual experiences. So on her, as you can see on this overview of her life, the red bits are the events that I'm going to focus on. I can't do all of Ermengarde in the time remaining. I can talk fast, but I can't talk that fast. So to encapsulate this rather rich life, I'm going to focus on certain highlights that reflect Marbod of Rennes' description of her as daughter of folk, glory of Brittany. The key moments I've chosen reveal the influence she exercised, but also the agency she had in determining the course of her life. This was not a woman who was a passive bystander in the events of her life and time. Rather, she was the architect of her own life, as much as any medieval person could be, and provided the counties of Brittany and Anjou, and hence Western France, with over 40 years of stable rule. By giving Ermengarde agency, I am deliberately pushing back against the historiographical tradition of making aristocratic women passive, bland objects. So Ermengarde as daughter of folk. Ermengarde was born in 1070 in Anjou, probably in Angers, the capital city of Anjou, at the communal castle, to Count Fulk le Rachin, and le Rachin means the surly or the grumpy. There's a great story about him from a 12th century chronicler that says he had constant bunions, so I'm convinced he was grumpy because his feet were sore. So her father was Count Fulk le Rachin, and her mother was Ermengarde of Beaugency. Our Ermengarde lost her mother when she was about 7, and she continued to be raised at her father's court and educated at the Abbey of Laurent-Serret, just across the river from the communal castle, right here. Okay. One of the questions I had about young Ermengarde was how was she educated about the skills and behaviors she would need to know as a woman of her class. Her father did remarry shortly after her mother's death, but the marriage was dissolved a couple years later when Ermengarde's stepmother decided to become a nun. About a decade later, Fulk would remarry again, but for most of Ermengarde's youth, she did not have a close female relative to act as a role model. At the Abbey of Laurent-Serret, however, Ermengarde interacted with mature women of the aristocracy who could provide the sort of guidance she would need, the nuns. Observing the abbess in her role as manager of a nunnery and a lord in her own right also provided Ermengarde with an exemplar. And the abbess of Laurent-Serret during Ermengarde's time was a formidable woman who was not afraid to exert her rights, including digging up bodies to prove her point. Additionally, memory of Ermengarde's great-grandmother, the founder of Laurent-Serret, Hildegard of Lotharingia, and her great-aunt were also present in the abbey. She would have heard of these women from the nuns, but also her own kin. As well as the skills necessary to succeed as countess, Ermengarde was also educated in the classics and the Bible by the nuns. Growing up in Angers was formative for Ermengarde, and her connections to the people there, people in places in Anjou, profoundly shaped her life. While Ermengarde's relationship to her stepmothers is opaque, that with her father is not. They were very close, a closeness that developed as a result of Ermengarde being brought up at her father's court. She was his sole heir for over 10 years and hence trained as his successor. Fulk would continue to consult Ermengarde and seek her advice until the very end of his life. Ermengarde also came of age during what scholars term the 12th century Renaissance. In other words, the revival in classical learning. Indeed, an important contributor to this cultural movement was the Loire School. Many of the prominent intellectuals and clergies associated with this school passed through the cathedral school at Angers, just a short distance from the communal castle. The nuns of Laurent-Serret were part of this intellectual dynamism and corresponded with one of the great poets of the time, Baudry de Bourgogne. Connected to this cultural revival was also a movement aimed at reforming the church, frequently called the Gregorian Reform movement. The seedbed for this reform activity sprung from the Abbey of Marmoutier, located in Loire Valley, just a short distance from Angers. As a young woman, Ermengarde traveled with her father to this abbey and was well acquainted with its abbots, monks, and reformers. Throughout her life, the Countess supported Marmoutier and the Reform movement and helped to cultivate ideas of reform when she became Countess of Brittany. This was the environment in which Ermengarde was raised. The 1090s was a pivotal decade for Ermengarde. She married in 1093 when she was about 23 and left Anjou for Brittany. Her husband, Count Alan IV of Brittany, was probably about 10 years older than she and had been married once before. So Ermengarde moved from Anjou to Brittany, from Angers to the Breton communal seats at Rennes and Nantes. During the first 3 years of marriage, Ermengarde had 2 sons, and in 1096, when her husband departed on crusade, she was pregnant with their 3rd child, who would be a daughter. Ermengarde maintained stability in Brittany during the 5 years Alan was gone, quote, exercising the laws and justice of making peace, unquote, as Abbot Geoffrey of Vendôme would describe. Count Alan returned from crusade in 1101, a changed man. It appears he may have contracted a lifelong debilitating condition, perhaps malaria. The years after his return also saw a change in the communal couple's marriage. By 1104, Ermengarde had left Brittany and had become a nun at the Abbey of Fontevraud, a short distance from Angers. What were the Countess's motives for leaving her husband and young children and her county? Like all people, Ermengarde was a complex individual governed by a variety of factors. Certainly, she was inspired by her dedication to religion, and indeed, throughout her life, she was on something of a spiritual journey. She had met Robert of Arbrissel, the founder of Fontevraud, in Angers, who even his critics recognized was a charismatic figure. Ermengarde was inspired by his vision of Reformed monasticism, where women and men lived together engaged in the Lord's work under the authority of an abbess. Fontevraud had only been established for a couple of years, and Ermengarde would have found that life there primitive, likely living in a shack and with very few creature comforts. But there were ties to Anjou that drew her to Fontevraud as well, and I would argue her move there was part of a political strategy. During the years between 1103 and 1106 were a time of crisis in the county of Anjou, as Ermengarde's father and Ermengarde's half-brother Geoffrey were in conflict. Geoffrey feared that their father preferred his youngest son Fulk over Geoffrey as his heir. In fact, Geoffrey was so alienated that he joined with his father's enemies in battle and supported them. Ermengarde's move to Fontevraud thus put her closer to the fight and gave her a neutral base of operations close to Angers, where she could work to resolve the discord between her father and brother. The Angevin men, Count Fulk IV, Geoffrey, and young Fulk, her two brothers, did come to Fontevraud when Ermengarde was there, and shortly after their visit, Fulk IV and Geoffrey were reconciled. Ermengarde's decision to leave Fontevraud in 1106 was also informed by the political situation. Why did Ermengarde opt to return to her life as countess? The accepted explanation was that she was ordered to do so by the church. However, there is no evidence that this was the case, aside from an oblique reference in a letter to her from Robert of Arbrissel written 10 years later. Consideration of the context of Ermengarde's life suggests a different interpretation, one that is consonant with the agency she exercised, the political climate, and the important role she played in the political community. In 1106, Ermengarde's half-brother Geoffrey died in battle. While tragic in and of itself, the news that Fulk IV, her father, had been involved in planning his son's murder was even more devastating. So maybe he really was surly. This implication resulted in a crisis of communal rule in Anjou, thus creating political instability in the county, but also upsetting the balance of power in Western France. Ermengarde was needed to support her father and to try to right the communal ship. Hence, she left the convent so that she had time to intervene, support, and advise. Ermengarde herself decided when she would join Fontevraud and also when she would leave. In 1109, 3 years later, Anjou would again call to her countess, daughter of Fulk. In April of that year, Count Fulk, her father, was on his deathbed, and he knew it. In preparation for his death, he issued several charters to atone for his rather serious and frequent misdeeds. Ermengarde was at his side. One of these dying requests records that Fulk, quote, especially consulted and asked his daughter, Countess of Brittany, to be at his side so that she could provide him with the benefit of her skillful and experienced counsel, unquote. The suspicion that Fulk IV had actively plotted his son's death, right, Ermengarde's half-brother, served to undercut his authority in the county. Complicating matters further was the relationship with his remaining male heir, soon to be Fulk V, was also extremely difficult and strained. As the elder Fulk lay on his deathbed, there was much tension in the county and anxiety about the peaceful transfer of power. Ermengarde did more than just provide good counsel. She was there to ensure the peaceful passing of power from her father to her half-brother. It was an encounter with an object, the episcopal staff at the Cathedral of Angers, that led me to better understand her role in this important transition. To affirm and sacramentalize one of his gifts to the church, Fulk le Rachan placed a staff, maybe this one, or baculus, in the hand of Ermengarde, who then gave the staff to the canons, symbolizing and enacting the transfer of power and property from the count to the church. Later that same day, Fulk the Younger, who was not present at his father's death, confirmed the donation by placing a key in the hands of the same canon to whom Ermengarde had given the staff. Ermengarde signed and witnessed the confirmation. These performative gestures were aimed at securing a stable transfer of power, and it was through Ermengarde, literally and physically, that power moved from her father to her brother. Ermengarde's connection to her family and Anjou were important factors in the decisions she made in charting her life course. Her skills were critical for the success of the Calmedal House of Anjou, and indeed the stability of Western France. Let us now turn to Ermengarde's role, as Marbod described her, as the glory of Brittany. From her return from Fontevraud in 1106 to 1112, when Count Alan himself retired to the monastery of Redon, Ermengarde and Alan ruled Brittany together. After 1112 onward, Ermengarde co-ruled with their son, Conan III. Events of 1117 are one illustration of why Ermengarde was considered the glory of Brittany. As we know, Ermengarde was widely recognized for her political acumen and good advice. Indeed, Bishop Marbod had praised her for her, quote, powerful eloquence and shrewd counsel, unquote. The papal legate in France, and the papal legate is the representative of the Pope in France, also knew of her skills and actively recruited her to assist in a serious development in the county of Brittany. Sometime in 1117, Ermengarde's son, Conan, and a group of his knights rode on to the lands of the monastery of Sainte-Croix of Camperlé and did violence to the monks and property. The damage was so bad that the monks were, quote, exiled to the wilderness for a year, unquote. The abbot of Sainte-Croix was understandably upset and appealed to the bishop for assistance, who in turn elevated it to the attention of the papal legate. The justification that young Conan provided was that he'd been told by the abbot of Redon that the property in question belonged to his abbey, to Redon. So Conan believed he was acting on behalf of Redon and expelling Sainte-Croix from the land. Unfortunately, Redon's claim was completely specious, and Conan ended up in serious trouble. Several church councils were called, and the count was threatened with excommunication. Conan's recklessness not only had implication for his own reputation, but also for creating a state of affairs that could tip toward war in Brittany. Recognizing the seriousness of the matter, the papal legate wrote to Countess Ermengarde to ask for her assistance in resolving this dispute. So here is the one document I have in her voice. It is part of the letter that was transcribed in the Cartulary of Sainte-Croix of Camperlé. So the papal legate writes to our friend Ermengarde, and the countess replied that she would be happy to work to restore peace between the two ecclesiastical communities. But she also flipped the tables on the legate to ask a favor of him as well. Would the clergy consider lifting the interdiction on Conan? Here the countess takes advantage of the situation to work it so that she's able to extricate her son from a very difficult position. And here's a translation, excerpts of her response. And as you can see, right, she says, your lofty slave, yada, yada, has you placed me between the monks so that I might strive to restore peace and concord, which I freely embrace. But however, I wonder if maybe you would see your way clear too, right, sort of in the vernacular, to see if we could resolve the situation with Conan. The legate agreed to her request, and Conan, at his mother's guidance, began the long process of making restitution for this misdeed. This episode demonstrates Ermengarde's political intelligence in ameliorating the blow to her son's status, negotiating peace between the two monasteries, but also how appreciated her skills were by distinguished leaders of the church and secular society. It was only in 1127, 10 years later, that the fallout from this misadventure was cleared away. With Conan's reputation and hold on the county secure, Ermengarde could now consider other priorities, which brings us to another fascinating moment in her life. Sometime around 1128, she became personally acquainted with Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the dynamic leader of the Cistercians. Now, the Cistercians are another order of monks that are developing in the 12th century, and they're very much sort of dedicated to apostolic poverty. And like Robert of Arbrisel, Bernard was a compelling figure, and Ermengarde became interested in the life of a Cistercian religious. In 1130, she left Brittany to become a nun at the Cistercian convent in Le Ray, As you can see, the excerpts from Conan's donation charter sort of outlines this episode in Ermengarde's life. Indeed, we are told that St. Bernard himself veiled her, a sign of the respect and friendship they enjoyed. However, Ermengarde was not happy with her new life, as Bernard's letters to her indicate, and regrettably, her letters to him didn't survive, naturally. Sometime around 1131 or 1132, she left the convent and France to travel to the Holy Land, and she would have been about 60 when she undertook this weeks-long and perilous journey. And I will say, Ermengarde and I are roughly contemporary, and I can barely contemplate the thought of getting on an airplane and going to Australia. I can't imagine, sorry Ian, I can't imagine, 16 hours on an airplane is my idea of hell, or 31 or however many it is, right? Not much fun. But imagine going from France via probably donkey, horse, camel, cart, and ship. It would probably have taken her several weeks to get to Jerusalem. And she does this she's not old, but she may have been used to some of the creature comforts of life. So I have to admit, I think it's a true testament to her fortitude and strength of character. The Countess had several reasons for wanting to travel to the birthplace of Christianity. Pilgrimage was a way that medieval people expressed their faith, and Ermengarde had several family members who had made the trip. Having the chance to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, but also visit the places resident with the Old and New Testament would have been compelling. It's also possible that she made the journey as a way of doing penance for leaving the Cistercian order. But there were also personal reasons. Her second son, Geoffrey, had perished in the Holy Land as a combatant. So she may have gone there to try to find his grave or see where he had died. Another ancestor that Ermengarde might have tried to trace would have been her great-grandmother Hildegard, the founder of Laurent-Cirey, who moved to Jerusalem as a widow